Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So I'm going to talk about the Afghanistan situation. So the Taliban have well and truly taken over. President Ashraf Ghani, he fled a few days ago. It's rumoured he's in Uzbekistan. We don't know. The Uzbek government is, of course, deeply hostile to the Taliban. The Uzbeks are Sunni Muslims, almost to a man. It's a very secular country, which is deeply suspicious of practicing Muslims. Anyway, so the Taliban have achieved shock and awe. They stunned and alarmed their neighbours, except for the Pakistanis, and provincial capitals fell like 9 pins. So their advance was much rapider than anybody had foreseen, and that's why Ghani was like a rat off a sinking ship. It's been a debacle for the United States. Many people say, all right, it wasn't the United States' intention to stay there any longer. The people who'd been arguing the United States ought to get out very fast, even treat the 2001 campaign as like a raid, go in, wreck the Taliban and get out. Because as they say, it's the graveyard of empires, which brought down Alexander the Great. That's not really why he fell. To some extent, the Mughal Empire, very often forgotten that, the Russian Empire, the British Empire, and well, now the United States. I don't think the United States is about to implode, but it's clearly not been fully successful for the United States. So some interpreters for the US military have been left behind. Others have gone to Turkey and so on. The United Kingdom was supposedly evacuating those Afghans who'd been cooperative and therefore would be in grave danger now that the Taliban have sway. So it was an astonishing scene, seeing Kabul airport, how anarchic it was on one side of the wire, where Afghan civilians were trying to get onto the plane, fighting to get onto these planes, standing remotely. And at the other side of the wire, the orderly withdrawal by the United States military. The Taliban did not attack the US military as they're leaving, just let them go. Don't provoke them into coming back in. So the United States left equipment behind for their Afghan allies, and it's virtually all been seized by the Taliban. So the Afghan army really just melted away. So why withdraw? The United States, in a sense, wasn't losing. On the other hand, it wasn't really winning, but they tried just about everything they could over the past 20 years. And they were there with plenty of allies. All the NATO countries sent troops. All right, say France and Germany sent only a small number, insisted they only serve in quiet sectors. The United States withdrew just because it doesn't want to be there forever. And it's too costly. Spent over $2 billion on this. So why should they say? Trump talked about withdrawing. Biden's actually achieved that. There'll be a virtue. There's a virtue to withdrawing. There's a virtue to winning. There's no virtue to staying endlessly and suffering without actually winning. And all right, whilst they were there, the Taliban could only advance so far. But although it actually wasn't that costly in lives, not even 3,000 Americans were killed there. But anyway, it was a drain on resources. And the American public had no appetite for further fighting. It was no longer seen as like a war of national survival. So the alternative was to stay indefinitely. And this has ended the conflict with the United States, at least. Conflict might continue in Afghanistan. So far, it seems to have been a decisive victory for the Taliban. No pockets of resistance, so far as I know, by the Afghan government. And if the Afghan government wasn't willing to fight for itself, why should the United States fight for it? So the Republican Party in the United States has sought to make mileage out of this. They can exploit these tragic scenes in Kabul. But what's their alternative? Trump wanted to get out. He was persuaded not to, and so he kept the soldiers there. A few more 100 American military personnel were killed, just so it would help Trump's electoral chances. And obviously for Biden, that was unconscionable. To remain for over 3 years until the next election, a few hundred young Americans get killed just so Biden would look tough. No, he's not doing it for PR reasons. The one thing about Afghanistan is war is the norm there. There's been a civil war for 43 years. I know that the factions have shifted back and forth. There's been a lot of double crossing. And okay, so it's not always the same issue all the time. Some people know no other job. It's a way of life. So will there be a peace dividend? Well, in some ways, no. The NGOs are pulled out, the journalists, the soldiers, all this foreign money. Kabul has actually become quite a developed city. But the United States could have kept a permanent presence there just to make sure the Taliban couldn't keep Kabul. But was that worth it? But, what if the Taliban attacked anyway? Was the United States going to get more deeply committed? I mean, that's the thing, is you can't fight a half war. It's like Colin Powell, you've got to do this by total commitment or else not at all. We can't do this by half measures. That's what the United States found out in Vietnam. So anyway, in 2020, the Trump administration signed a deal with the Taliban, so much for him being so tough on terrorism. Well, the Taliban really had to do nothing. They didn't have to hand over anything. They had no prisoners to hand over. So they can break all these promises, knowing the United States is desperate to stay out, was going to withdraw. Anyway, tell the Americans what they want to hear. The Trump administration put that out as a success. They'll pull out, and the Taliban can take over anyway, and also cut the Afghan government off at the knees. So with those talks in Doha, so people said there have been shades to Saigon about this. Perhaps there have. Remember, it took over 2 years after the United States withdrew from Vietnam for Saigon to fall. This has happened even before the United States has completed its pullout. So in Afghanistan, far fewer Americans were killed than in Vietnam. So the situations are not quite analogous. Not even 3,000 in Afghanistan, 58,000 in Vietnam. Bearing in mind, the United States was fighting in Vietnam for only, let's say, 9 years, not 20 years, and the US population was smaller in the 60s than it is today. So proportionally, the casualties for the United States in Vietnam were much, much higher. So obviously it had an explicit UN Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force there. Russia and China voted for that. It was a NATO operation, so had many, many allies, and there was some success, certainly for a few years. Taliban have moderated a little bit on women, allowing some women education. So I know of a senior Taliban who has a daughter studying at a university in Turkey, allowing television, some sports, not trying to annihilate the Shia. Even Saudi Arabia has moderated, which is a sort of the big daddy of the Sunni extremist world, often the paymaster of the Taliban. There's been the Arab Spring. So the world has moved forward from where we were 20 years ago. But in some ways, the American experience in Afghanistan was more ignominious than that of the Soviets, because the communist government in Afghanistan survived for over 3.5 years after the Soviet withdrawal. The Soviets didn't have foreign allies helping them. I don't know why they didn't insist the Warsaw Pact send troops as well. And the Soviets didn't actually spend that much there. They spent something only like $20 billion over 10 years. Admittedly, $1 billion in the 80s was worth way, way more than it is today. And they had an annual military budget of about $128 million, partly because they pay their people so badly and their equipment's quite cheap. The other thing is the Soviets hadn't had to worry about any free press, any legal or ethical restraints. You can just kill anyone you want and you'll never get into trouble about it. The United States, obviously, they have killed civilians sometimes, but it's not been on a huge scale. So there's Schadenfreude in Moscow. Okay, the Russians can't help gloating that you were less successful than us. But there's been some selective amnesia on behalf of the Russian Federation. Russia gave its explicit blessing to the US mission in 2001. It facilitated it, it expedited it by allowing the US military to use Russian airspace. It encouraged its Central Asian satellites to allow the United States to use military bases there, which they did. Anyway, Russia now treats this whole thing with some trepidation. You may have heard of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a military alliance comprising Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. That's Russia's answer to the Warsaw Pact, obviously much, much smaller. And Russia's got about 80% of the population, about 90% of the firepower there. So Russia's worried about the Taliban ideology being alluring to its own Sunni Muslim minority. At least 12% of Russian citizens are Muslims. The Chechens and the Tatars, for example, indigenous ethnic minorities. Iran is perturbed by the Taliban's rise because, of course, it's a deadly foe of Iran, and Iran sees itself as the protector of the Hazara ethnic minority, about 10% of the Afghan population, who are Shia Muslims, like most Iranians. The many Hazaras have fled. So Pakistan has more sway than ever before. It's got that strategic depth it wanted, because they say the trouble is we're long north to south, we're not very far east to west, we can't retreat very much. I would like Afghanistan to be little more than an adjunct to Pakistan. But they have limited sway over the Taliban. Taliban didn't always do what they wanted to. The Taliban is actually rather vociferous. So this is bad news for India. They could have had an ally in Afghanistan. They'd always recognise the sort of a non-fundamentalist government in Afghanistan. China's going to pay for the reconstruction of Afghanistan, handing over the funds to the Pakistanis, who'll then dish it out to their favourites in Afghanistan. So Pakistan is little more than a Chinese vassal state, because there's an economic corridor that the Chinese are building through Pakistan in terms of roads, railways, ports, airports, part of the Belt and Road scheme. But this has fathomed the depth of cynicism. The Islamic Republic of Pakistan, men believe in the Ummah, worldwide solidarity for all Muslims, and yet there is deafening silence about the horrific human rights abuses that Beijing is perpetrating against the Uyghurs, its indigenous Muslim minority in Xinjiang province. So they're going to be just thrown to the wolves. Likewise, the Taliban dare not offend Cathay. So anyway, the Taliban is banned in China and Russia, and yet they are effusively lauding it. So there's a possibility of TAPI being built, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, but the construction has been very, very slow. So Uzbekistan and Tajikistan are worried about encroachment by the Taliban. They welcome more Russian troops there. They've had military exercises over the past month. So in many ways, this is a defeat for NATO. So I think, to paraphrase Harry Enfield, NATO know your limits. But their heart really wasn't in it. They weren't willing to send enough troops to suffer enough. They were irresolute, unwilling to pay the blood price. I'm not willing to pay it with my blood, certainly. So it requires sacrifice. A lot of people are getting killed, as well as a lot of money being spent. Tax cuts, borrowing more, spending cuts, have to have retrenchment in other areas of spending. But it was never vital enough. It was never perceived as a war of national survival or a discretionary war. So we still want to grow the economy. The Afghan issue just wasn't very salient in most countries. So what else was to be done after 9/11? Rather than let this be a sort of cesspit for Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, where they could train, be armed, raise money through heroin sales, and then launch attacks on the Occident. So I had to be proactive to hit them before they hit you. So the political will gradually evaporated. People said we won't cut and run. Well, that's what's happened. There's no Northern Alliance to speak of now, as there was in the 90s. The Taliban sealed the border with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Turkmenistan a couple of weeks ago. Ironically, Turkmenistan's got the best relationship with the Taliban, willing to recognise them, and the deal is non-interference, which the Taliban at least paying lip service to that for the moment. But it'd be very, very difficult to get going in Turkmenistan because it's such a police state, informers everywhere. So there's not been much pushback from the US electorate against Joe Biden's decision. 70% of the population in favour of what he's done, about 20% against. Obviously, some are neutral or undecided. But Republicans will inveigh against him that he was a wimp and so on. What are you going to do? Go back in? It was your hero's policy, Trump's policy to withdraw. Admittedly, Biden didn't have to go along with that, but he did go along with that. I think that there are no votes in intervening afresh in Afghanistan. Tucker Carlson, I think the one service he's done to the world was talking Trump out of more wars abroad, like into going against Iran. So the benefit of the United States is it's opened a front against Iran. The Iranians are worried we'll have to deploy some troops to their eastern flank. The Taliban may have learned a lesson not to provoke the West because they paid a very, very heavy price over the past 20 years. They've ultimately triumphed because they managed to sap the will of their opponent. This is the sort of war of the flea, the death of 1,000 cuts, even though the United States didn't suffer any defeats overall. But just by simply keeping it going, the longevity of the conflict, it wore down the Americans. This was attrition because they didn't want to be there forever, and the Taliban did want to be there forever. So the US, United States had to go away eventually. So just be patient. Once they announce the date for withdrawal, then they think the Afghan government was foredoomed. We'll sit on our hands. We'll relax. We'll conserve our strength. And then when the Americans go, we can quite easily defeat the Afghan army. So I think there'll be fewer Oriental adventures in future. Are we coming to more of a multipolar world? So Russia's glad, in a sense, that the Americans are out of what they see as their sphere of influence, their backyard. They think they can be the regional hegemon, the Chinese likewise. But if this is no longer America's problem, it might be Russia's. So decidedly mixed feelings about what's happened. So please follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok and so forth, and donate to me on PayPal at georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Toodaloo.